The leaders that we studied from different companies, different countries, different industries, they really focused on making sure that their organizations were both willing and able to innovate. And so Linda covered the willingness piece, and that's really the foundation for making sure that you have an organization that's going to be able to innovate. But it's necessary and not sufficient on its own. Because in order to sustain innovation over time, what organizations need to do is develop 3 key capabilities. And I'll just talk about each of those briefly. And I thought I'd give you an example with each of them from Pixar Animation Studios, where we spent a lot of time and where I think people are always curious to hear about, and we're all familiar with their films. So the first capability is creative abrasion. And this is really the ability to come up with new ideas through intellectual discourse and debate. And creative abrasion is, I'm sure we've all been in these situations, it's when you have that idea sparring, when you get people who think differently together in a room and really begin to kind of abrade their ideas up against each other and make sure that they're coming up with better and better ideas. Now, for most of us, it's actually pretty difficult to do this because, first of all, a lot of us don't like to embrace conflict. If anything, we avoid it. And then the other thing is that even if people are really trying to focus on the ideas, it's often difficult because people can kind of get their feelings hurt if their ideas aren't the ones that are accepted. So what we found is that it's very important for the leader to play a role in shaping the kind of environment where creative abrasion can actually happen, and it's pretty rare to see. So the first thing leaders need to do is make sure that they're really creating an environment that balances support on one hand and confrontation on the other. So support is about making sure that people feel psychologically safe enough to actually share their ideas, so they feel like I can take a risk, I'm not going to be punished if this idea turns out to be a dumb one. But on the other hand, the companies we studied, I mean, it matters that you perform. And so the leaders had to make sure that there was some confrontation built in the system so that people weren't actually getting too comfortable just kind of sharing their ideas and leaving it at that. They actually wanted people to have these good fights. The other things that leaders really need to do is make sure that people feel that they're valued for their individual identity, that their ideas actually matter, that the diversity in the organization, and we mean intellectual diversity, is there for an actual reason. But then at the same time, they need to make sure that the group is actually focusing on that collective identity, that fundamentally that the group is going to be able to perform collectively as a group, and that's what we see in the Pixar movies, which are obviously a single collective effort. So at Pixar, one of the practices that Linda and I were very lucky to see was called the dailies, and it's where the animators would come and meet with the director and go over a particular scene in a movie. So one of the interesting things about the animators at Pixar is that while they actually work on the computer, they're trained, most of them I should say, are trained as actors. And so they would come in a room together each day and actually act out the scenes. And it was fascinating because you would have people who had the same information about the characters, but then they would actually have really different interpretations. And so these were supportive sessions in the sense that these are people who are truly, I mean, if you're an animator at Pixar, you're literally the best in the world at what you do. But, I mean, it can be a little bit competitive. On one hand, people were very excited to hear their colleagues' ideas, but on the other hand, everybody wanted to have their idea be the one that was ultimately used in the film. And so these sessions had the potential to be very dysfunctional if they happened at a lot of the companies that I think a lot of us are familiar with. But at Pixar, what the director was actually able to do is, again, kind of shepherd this context where animators felt like, okay, I can share my idea, people are actually going to listen to it, I'm going to get some feedback on it, I might end up in a slightly different place than where I was initially when I came into the room. And great if my idea is accepted and it's in the movie and I can kind of point to it to my friends, but if it turns out it's not accepted, I feel like I had a hand in this process, and when I'm watching the movie, I still feel like I played a role in this scene. And so that's the kind of thing, when we talk about creative abrasion, that you need to create this special environment that really balances these different tensions. The second capability that we discovered to be really important is one that we call creative agility. And this is about making sure that your organization can experiment so that you can kind of quickly come up with new ideas and pursue them, reflect on them by collecting data, and then adjust yourselves accordingly. So again, this is difficult to do. A lot of people, I know myself, feel kind of more comfortable with a classic project management situation where you have a clear end date and you have clear interim deadlines. Everybody knows what role everybody's playing. But the reality is that, as Linda said, with innovation, if you don't necessarily know where you're going or how you're going to get there, it's not particularly productive to use kind of classic project management in getting, for example, a Pixar movie done. And this is why, again, at Pixar, what the leaders focused on, and we saw this broadly in the organizations we studied, is really making sure that on one hand you had an environment that was really supportive of learning and development. So making sure that people could continually test out their different ideas, really had the bandwidth to learn, And at the same time, they needed to make sure that, this goes to kind of the harnessing piece, that people were focused on performance, because after all, these are businesses, even a place like Pixar. The leaders also needed to make sure, for creative agility, that on one hand the organization had enough kind of room that people could really improvise. If they came up with a new idea for even a new product line, service line, they would actually have the ability to kind of run with it. But at the same time, the leaders needed to make sure that there was enough structure in place so that the organization didn't just degenerate into chaos. And so at Pixar, it takes 5 years and 200 to 300 people to make one of those films that we watch in a quick 2 hours. And so they liken it there. Many people told us that they kind of think about it as making a Pixar film is like jumping out of an airplane and putting together a parachute on the way down before you hit the ground. And kind of hitting the ground is like hitting the deadline when there's hundreds of millions of dollars riding on the movie coming out on time and all of the associated merchandise, etc. And so one of the things that I didn't appreciate about the Pixar movies until we spent time there is that each of them really pushes the boundaries of what's technologically possible. So at the start of a movie, you have a kind of a kernel of an idea for a story, and it's fleshed out to a certain extent. But until people actually begin really working on the movie, it's not really clear exactly how the story is going to unfold. And often, it's not really clear what technology you're going to need to get that director's vision up on the screen. So one of the things that's very, very difficult to do in CG movies is to get hair or fur actually looking right and not looking crazy. So for Monsters, Inc., Sully, the blue monster, I don't know if people remember him, but he was an absolute nightmare to actually get looking right. His hair was either kind of falling completely flat down, like it was being pulled by gravity, or it was sticking straight out. It just looked completely wrong. Obviously, this was a big problem for Pixar because this was one of the stars of the show. And Pixar said, we still want to try to do this movie because each time we're going to try to really push the bounds of what's possible. So a group of, I think it was nearly 24 people were working. These were computer scientists, animators, people who were trying to figure out how can we actually get Sully to look okay on the screen. And they took months doing this. And as time ticked on, the leadership at Pixar said, look, we know that this is a problem that literally nobody has ever tackled before in CG movies. We're going to give you the time to really kind of experiment with doing it right. But as time ticked closer to the release date, the leadership had to really kind of focus more on that harnessing piece and said, look, we got to get this out by the deadline. You're going to need to perform here. And at this point, they actually, in putting in that kind of constraint in the structure, the people who were working on this were actually able to, they were kind of forced to come up with a jerry-rigged solution so that this could, the hair looks fine in the film and it looks good actually, but it turns out that kind of in the background, if you looked at the code of it, it's like a complete mess. It's not something you'd talk about at a conference of here's kind of a best practice of how to do fur, but it looked great and it got the thing done. And actually it was funny because when Linda and I were at Google interviewing some people shortly after kind of hearing about this story from Pixar, we ran into some top people at Google who were like, when we saw Monsters, Inc. in the movie theater, we could not believe that they had actually figured out how to really get Sully's fur done. So it was truly a very difficult problem that engineers were impressed to actually see this done. The third capability, just quickly, is creative resolution. And this is about figuring out how to create integrative decisions that really combine sometimes even opposing ideas. So Linda talked a little bit earlier about how often innovation is really about not taking option A or option B, but how do we create an option C? And that's really what creative resolution is about. And of course, on one hand, it requires that leaders make sure that all the ideas in an organization actually get out on the table so they can be considered. But on the other hand, it means that somebody actually needs to do that hard work of figuring out how are we going to integrate these so that it's not just kind of a chaotic set of ideas, but something that looks integrated. So again, at Pixar, one of the things that's unique about the studio is that everybody inside of Pixar, everybody who works there, whether you're a cook in the kitchen or an animator or a lighter, you're allowed to give notes on the movie. And this is very different from how things work traditionally in Hollywood. Typically, the kind of suits run the show, even the creative decisions. At Pixar, the creatives run those decisions, but also they really seek input from people all over the studio. This is actually really rare. So one of the challenges, one of the good things that creates is you get all kinds of ideas on a movie coming from all kinds of people with different perspectives. But then the challenge is, okay, how do we take all of these different ideas and figure out how to really integrate them? Is one of the directors said, a movie has tens of thousands of ideas in it, and so the challenge is to figure out how can we actually kind of integrate this so that it's kind of a singular piece of work. So that's the process that the leaders there have to go through, and they again make sure that they get those ideas on the table, and at the same time the directors in concert with others at the studio kind of sift through those ideas and make sure that at the right time they're kind of integrating them. So again, these are the 3 organizational capabilities. I talked about Pixar, but we saw them happening in the law firm, at an Indian IT company, at this Korean luxury goods company, so truly at companies all over the world. And that's kind of the core of the finding, the willingness and ability. And